My name was Evelyn once. That night, under the shadow of the ancient oak tree in Blackthorn Hollow, I began to lose everything that tied me to that name. My role in the village was somber but vital. I was the undertaker, the one who carried the dead to their rest. Most avoided me, whispering behind my back about the way I lingered near graveyards and how my lantern burned blue instead of gold. I was used to the loneliness. It started with a letter. There was no name, no signature, just precise instructions. Someone wanted an empty coffin buried beneath the oldest tree in the woods, the one they called the gallows oak. I knew better than to question it. The work seemed simple, and the coin promised in return would help me through the cold season. The night was damp and heavy as I trudged into the forest with my tools and my lantern. The tree was easy to find. It loomed like a skeletal giant, its branches twisted as if frozen mid-writhing. I began digging, the wet earth giving way beneath my spade. The rhythm of the digging calmed my nerves until, far too soon, I hit something solid. It wasn't the coffin I'd brought. What my spade struck was much smaller, a box, old and carved with markings that seemed to hum faintly in the still air. I hesitated, my breath catching. The box felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there, like I shouldn't be touching it. But curiosity can be louder than reason. With trembling hands, I pulled it free from the soil and brushed away the dirt. The carvings were deep, precise, and unlike anything I'd seen before, symbols of something ancient, something unknowable. I told myself not to open it, that it wasn't part of my task, but some force pulled at me, a whisper in the back of my mind. So I opened it. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a shard of black glass. It seemed alive, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I couldn't stop myself, my fingers reached for it. The moment I touched the shard, everything changed. A voice rasped in my mind, deep and cold, and it spoke words I didn't understand. Then it said,
"You have awakened me now. We begin."
I stumbled back, dropping the shard, but it didn't fall. It hovered in the air, pulsing brighter, darker. My lantern flickered violently, the blue flame sputtering before flaring into a sickly, unnatural glow. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and then the knocking began. The knocking came from the coffin I had brought with me, the one I knew was empty. 3 sharp, deliberate raps that echoed unnaturally in the clearing. My heart thundered in my chest, and I stumbled back, staring at the coffin as though it might lurch toward me. I wanted to run, but something rooted me to the spot. My hand clenched the handle of my lantern tightly, the light flickering in shaky patterns across the gnarled tree and the dirt beneath it. The knocking came again, louder this time, and then the lid splintered. The thing that emerged wasn't of this world. Its body was wrapped in burial shrouds, torn and rotted, revealing glimpses of something both solid and smoke-like underneath. Its face, or what passed for one, was a hollow void, empty and black, yet its eyes burned like embers, searing into me with a hateful, otherworldly light. It rose slowly, unnaturally, its movements wrong in ways I couldn't describe. Then it turned toward me, and I could feel its gaze even though it had no true eyes. It raised a hand, long fingers stretching outward, and dark tendrils spilled from its grasp, curling toward me like living shadows.
"You brought me forth,"
it said. Its voice wasn't singular. It was a chorus of whispers, all layered over one another, echoing into the night.
"And now you will serve."
"No," I gasped, backing away. My hand reached instinctively for the shard where it still hovered, pulsating in the air. Gripping it felt like plunging my hand into ice water, but I didn't let go. I hurled the shard at the creature, and it struck its chest with a dull sound, before sinking into the void where its heart should have been. For a moment, everything froze. The creature trembled, its tendrils retreating. My heart dared to hope that I had stopped it, but that hope was short-lived. The ground beneath the oak split apart, the roots writhing as though alive. Skeletal hands clawed their way out of the soil, gripping at the earth with bony fingers. Ghostly shapes began to rise from the shadows, their forms translucent but unmistakably human. They wailed, their cries filled with pain and rage, and the sound seemed to pierce my very soul. The lantern flared again, brighter than ever, its sickly glow bathing the clearing in crimson light. I tried to drop it, to run, but my body no longer obeyed me. The shard's voice returned, louder now, clearer.
They are mine, and so are you.
The creature's tendrils lashed out again, snaring my arms, my legs, my neck. I felt the cold seep into my body as it dragged me forward, closer to that terrible void of a face. I wanted to scream, to fight, but it was as if my mind had been swallowed whole. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the tendrils withdrew. The clearing was silent, save for the faint moans of the dead who now surrounded me. I looked down at my hands and gasped. They weren't hands anymore. My hands were no longer flesh, but shadow, swirling and unstable. Dark veins crept up my arms, visible even beneath the sleeves of my coat. I wanted to cry out, to demand answers, but the only sound that came from my mouth was an unearthly whisper. It wasn't my voice anymore. I staggered, trying to will my body to obey, but the shard's presence was too strong. Its voice filled my head again, louder now. Impossible to ignore.
You are reborn, Harbinger. The world belongs to us, and you will lead the way.
No, I whispered, though it felt hollow. My words didn't even echo in my mind the way they should. The creature that had emerged from the coffin stood before me, its ember-like eyes burning brighter. It extended a skeletal hand, as if commanding me to rise against my will. I obeyed. My legs moved of their own accord, steady and slow, carrying me away from the oak and toward the village. I carried the lantern, its crimson light casting an eerie glow ahead of me. Behind me, the dead followed, spectral figures, twisted and translucent, each one more horrifying than the last. Some were skeletal, while others were decayed mockeries of the living. All of them were silent, except for the faint wails that drifted from their broken mouths. As the edge of the forest came into view, I spotted the first light of Blackthorn Hollow. The village, nestled in its quiet valley, seemed so peaceful from a distance. For a fleeting moment, the sight of it pierced through the haze in my mind, and I remembered the faces of the people who lived there. The widow Mara, who always nodded to me in the mornings, the blacksmith, whose booming laugh could be heard from across the square, the children, daring each other to approach my workshop, but too afraid to ever cross the threshold. I wanted to stop, to turn back, but the shard wouldn't let me. Evelyn. The voice startled me. Mara stood on her porch, her lantern raised high, its warm yellow glow a stark contrast to the sickly red light of mine. She squinted through the mist, her frail figure trembling. "Is that you?" she asked, her voice wavering. I tried to speak, to warn her, but the shard's power held my tongue. Instead, I raised the lantern, and its crimson light flared. The army of the dead surged forward, moving past me like a tide. Mara barely had time to scream before the first spirit reached her. It passed through her body, and her cry cut off abruptly. She fell to her knees, gasping as another spirit followed, then another. Her form began to shift. Her skin turned pale as bone, her eyes darkened into empty voids, and her movements became slow, jerky, and unnatural. When she finally rose, she was no longer Mara. Mara stepped from her porch, her lantern falling to the ground with a dull thud. She joined the procession of the dead without a word, her once kind face now a hollow mask. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, as though some unseen strings guided her every step. The village bells began to toll moments later, their desperate clangs ringing out into the misty air. The sound sent shivers through what little remained of my human consciousness, but the shard within me was unbothered. Instead, its voice hissed in my mind, brimming with satisfaction.
They know we are here. Let them ring their bells. It will not save them.
I wanted to scream, to shout a warning to the villagers, but instead, My body pressed forward, the crimson lantern lighting the path. I could see them now, men, women, even children, gathering in the village square, clutching torches and pitchforks, their faces tight with fear. "Evelyn," someone shouted. The blacksmith's voice carried over the din, deep and familiar. He stood at the center of the square, his massive frame holding a blackened hammer. "What's the meaning of this? What are you doing?" I stopped at the edge of the square, the glow of my lantern casting eerie shadows across the cobblestones. The dead behind me fanned out, their moans rising into the night like a twisted symphony. "Evelyn," the blacksmith roared again, "answer me." But it wasn't me who answered. The shard spoke through me, twisting my voice into something cold and unfamiliar.
"I am no longer Evelyn,"
I said, the words spilling from my mouth without my consent.
"I am the Harbinger, and you belong to us now."
The blacksmith's eyes widened as the crimson light of my lantern flared brighter, bathing the square in its sickly hue. The dead surged forward, a relentless tide of spectral forms. "Hold the line," the blacksmith shouted, raising his hammer high. The villagers screamed as the spirits descended, their translucent bodies passing through walls, weapons, and flesh alike. It was chaos. The villagers swung their torches and tools wildly, but nothing could stop the spirits. One by one, they fell. Each time a spirit passed through a body, it ripped something essential away, leaving behind empty shells with blackened eyes and pale, lifeless skin. The blacksmith was the last to fall. He swung his hammer in a wide arc, his face twisted with rage. The blacksmith's hammer smashed through the spectral forms, passing harmlessly through them as though they were made of mist. His defiance was admirable, but it was futile. A towering spirit emerged from the crowd of the dead, its form jagged and towering, like a grotesque shadow given life. It reached for him with elongated claws, its touch barely brushing his chest before he froze. The blacksmith's eyes widened, his hammer slipping from his grasp with a loud clang. He fell to his knees, clutching at his chest, as his breath came in shallow gasps. The spirit passed through him completely, and when it was gone, his transformation was swift and horrifying. His skin turned ashen, his eyes black as coal. He rose slowly, his movements jerky, and his expression void of the fire that once burned there. The hammer lay forgotten at his feet as he shuffled to join the ranks of the dead, another soldier in the army I now commanded. The village square was silent now, save for the soft moans of the spirits and the faint rustling of wind through the empty streets. Blackthorn Hollow was no longer a place of life. Every soul that had called it home now stood among the undead, their faces devoid of expression, their bodies moving only at the shard's will. The shard's voice filled my mind again, stronger now, almost triumphant. "This is only the beginning. The world is vast, and we will consume it all. Move. Harbinger, there is much work to do." I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but there was no point. My body no longer belonged to me. The lantern in my hand pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, guiding me forward. Behind me, the army of the dead followed, their ranks stretching endlessly into the mist. I walked through the streets of the village, past homes that had once been warm and welcoming. The bakery where I used to buy bread was dark, its windows shattered. The small chapel where children once played was eerily silent, its bell hanging crooked and still. At the edge of the village, I turned back for a brief moment. Blackthorn Hollow had been my home, my world. Now it was a graveyard, empty of life and hope, but the shard wouldn't let me linger. It pulled at me, its voice sharp and commanding.
"There are other villages, other souls to take. Go, Harbinger, spread the light of the lantern. Let the world tremble before us."
With every step I took, the faint part of me that still remembered being Evelyn grew dimmer. My memories felt like shadows, slipping further away with each passing moment. The shard was winning. Ahead, the path stretched into darkness, the crimson glow of my lantern illuminating only the immediate road. My army followed, their wails growing louder as the next village loomed in the distance. The shard promised this would never end, that the entire world would fall into its grip. And deep inside, a small part of me feared it would be right.